is a meeting of the Greenfield City Council Ways and Means Committee. This meeting is being recorded, videotaped, and broadcast live. If any other persons present are doing the same, please let me know at this time. I know GCTV is recording. Clerk Scott, would you take the
Wheeler,
yes.
Yes, the council is recording and the meeting is also being recorded on WebEx.
Very good. Thank you, Clerk Scott. Would you take the roll at this time, please?
Certainly. Councilor Wheeler?
Here.
Councilor Forgy?
Here.
Councilor Bottomley?
Here.
Councilor Disorder?
Here.
Councilor Elmer?
Here.
Councilor Wheeler, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Clerk Scott. All right, welcome everyone to our second budget meeting of the season. 2 of 5, we're getting there. On the agenda tonight is public safety. So police and fire. We're gonna go, I think before we start, I wanna just reiterate a couple things for the subcommittee members. We've had some questions for department heads, and that's great because that gives them time to prepare and have their answers and any figures ready during the meetings. But I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have questions for the department heads, please send them to me and CC Kathy and Tammy. That way we can aggregate the questions rather than kind of, we don't want to inundate the department heads with multiple emails. And we also want to make sure that we address the questions during the meeting so that counselors who might be watching from home or watching later on will hear the answers as well. That said, I'm gonna operate slightly out of order tonight, and we're gonna start with the revolving funds in light of that being really probably the quickest item on the agenda. So if you scroll to, I think that's just the second and third pages in your agenda packets, you'll see the authorization for the revolving fund spending limits. I'm not going to read the order because we're not voting on it tonight. We'll be voting a recommendation on the spending limits at the conclusion of the Ways and Means budget process. That said, Director Gilman is here and Director Warner is here. And so if we have any questions, and the mayor is here. So if we have questions around the revolving funds, I would entertain those at this time. Councilor Forgy.
Thank you. Am I on? I think I am.
You are.
Okay. I'm actually curious as to what has happened in the past regarding the revolving funds. I know what they are, I know what the purpose is and everything else, but tonight we're actually being asked to specify certain funds are going to continue over and certain funds are going to close out to the general fund. Can you give us a rationale of that, Mayor?
Actually, I'm actually going to defer to the actual expert, who is Liz.
Okay, Liz, thanks. Thanks, Mayor.
Hi there. So as you can see at the top of the page, it says that there are 53 E&a-half funds, and that is a particular statute of Mass General Law, that there are certain revolving funds that exist just by adopting a statute one time. And forever after that revolving fund may exist. These particular ones, because they're 53 and an E and a half, have to be approved for dollar amounts. Now, we can vote, and maybe we'll do this next year, to only do this when there's a change in the dollar limit, because that is something that came through out of the Modernization Act. But since everyone is just getting familiar with it, I think that's something we can look to do next year, once everyone's comfortable with what they are and how they're utilized. Now, some of the funds do carry forward, and some of the funds, the balance close to the general fund. And that's how it's written. For example, on your local receipts, which is sometimes kind of confusing, the health permits and the building department revolving of these do close to the general fund, and they are your local receipts for the building department and the health department that you see in local receipts. Another one that closes is a transfer station, the dog licenses, and there's another, ordinance enforcement. That closes under the miscellaneous. They have been set up that way. I've actually had a discussion with Councilor Wheeler that I almost prefer the building department and the health department to be contained within the general fund, because it does give the department a little flexibility if something comes up that they aren't expense-wise, that they aren't prepared for, but they also are limited by a dollar amount. And also, there's always a reserve fund in my mind too, but sometimes you can't wait for council, 2 months of council meeting to go ahead to the reserve fund. Some of these, you will see they specify the kind of expenses, like salaries, full-time salaries cannot be put to these accounts, only part-time. If you did a full-time, you also have to charge the benefits. It's just the way the statute is written. So it is, there are a lot of them, but for many of the departments, individually, it's not, other than the transfer station, but that's kind of understandable since there are full-time staff in there. It's not an excessive amount of money in each one. I know there's a lot, but I don't know if you have any questions on any individual ones. And quite honestly, I would defer to the fire chief on the ambulance one and the fire one and the police chief on the property sales.
Did that answer?
Questions on those?
Yeah. Thanks, Director Gilman. I'm going to call on Director Elmer in 1 second, but I just wanted to make sure that Councilor Forgy, did that answer your question, or did you have a follow-up to that?
It did provide a lot of information for some of us that are not as familiar with the structure of special revenue and things of that nature. But I wondered, you mentioned an act that came in that we have to, are we actually, I'm thinking this language has always been there. I'm wondering why we are doing this language now. Has it been something that wasn't in effect in the past for some reason?
That is correct. The Modernization Act was passed in 2016. So
Okay.
It did require an annual vote.
Okay.
And it gave you the option to say, but you have to vote the option to say, I only want to vote it if there's a change.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much.
Great. Councilor Elmer,
Yes, thank you. I want to ask the question that Councillor Forgy didn't need to have answered, which is, and I've had this answered before, but it's hard to grasp. What exactly is a revolving fund? I know it's money that gets poured into a pot that can be drawn from and then it gets replenished, but it's not clear to me how it gets replenished, etc. So maybe just the revolving fund 101.
Okay, revolving fund 101. So they differ from the general fund because the general fund closes out every year. These funds, for the most part, unless it specifies here, their balance carries forward. They generally have a revenue source. It might be a permit fee. It might be a service that's being provided. So that's how it gets replenished. The fire prevention, I believe, is some fees that are there. The ambulance services, that kind of makes sense, you know, the fees for the ambulance. So that's where the revenue comes and that's where it gets replenished. They are different from the fact that they carry forward, and they're different because they are either in Mass General Law as a statute that you would adopt at council meeting, and then you only adopt it once. School choice is an example. Some of the other school funds are very good examples. So we don't have to vote those each year. These particular ones are called 53E1/2 because the statute they fall under says that you may establish these, and it has a revenue source, like you stated, and the expenses have to coincide with the revenue source. So your expenses for generating that revenue needs to correlate with the revenue that's coming in. So transfer station fees has transfer station expenses. Ambulance service fees has to have ambulance service expenses. But it's different from the general fund because the balance can carry forward. And the general fund closes at the end of the year. Okay? We can talk again if that's...
Councillor DeSorger. I think your microphone.
I have a question.
There you go.
Yeah, I have a question, and actually this was the one I was looking at was the library fines fund. There's a general question and a specific question. All of those that are, I get what they are, but are any of them ever repurposed, or can any of them ever be repurposed for any particular use? And I was not picking on, but using the library, thinking of just as an example, that of course their fine fund is going to be down, and they will be in the process of moving, and we may be in, having, not maybe, we'll be having some difficult fiscal issues this year. So I wasn't trying to make a change. I was just asking that question.
No, that's a good question. But as of right now, no, they cannot be repurposed. However, at the mayor's meeting that I had listened in on the other day, that did come up that if that legislation went through, it could help cities and towns. But as of right now, you can't repurpose them.
And that's
you need to follow the reason for which they were established.
Thank you.
Okay. Director Warner, anything you'd like to add about the two funds that are under DPW? I know the transfer station one is really the biggest.
Yeah, I think as far as the transfer station, the revolving fund there is we have 8 employees up there, and 2 of the employees are carried under the revolving fund along with their benefits. The other revolving fund that I have is the signage revolving fund. That has to do with our agreement with the sign machine through the FERCOG. That replaces software and materials to keep that program going. That basically sums up the 2 revolving funds I have.
Okay, great. Any questions from counselors on any of the revolving funds? All right. Seeing none, I think we'll move on to public safety, and we'll call Chief Haig back to the computer. And so, counselors, if you want to get ready, we're going to move to page 94 of your budget book has the line items for the police department. All right. Welcome, Chief. I'll let you, if you'd like, say a few words to start.
Good evening once again from my kitchen. Yeah, no, I'm pretty much ready to roll if you are. I put together a budget that essentially doesn't add any personnel. It keeps the people that we have. It doesn't really have any extras in there. Some of the increases that we have were for different things like the camera system. You know, you'll see a big jump, and I guess I should probably just go through the big jump lines because those are the ones that stick out the most. Salaries, obviously, but we had a 3-year hiatus from negotiations, and we had to do a 3-year retro. So that's what's recognized as far as the salaries: 3-year retro on supervisors, 1-year retro on patrol. And then we had some big jumps in the expense side, which was telephone, you'll see, but that covers our internet and our air cards, which is part of the cruiser camera system that we have in there. I had to reduce that a little bit after that first round of kind of asked cuts, and because we need some additional equipment in there for the cameras to be live streamed to the station. Right now they're not, because we need that that extra bandwidth and the cards to go in the system into the cruisers. So I've removed that. That doesn't remove the camera system. It just doesn't allow for that live view feature, and that's one of the reasons we got it. That's a big safety issue as far as that goes. Some of the other big jumps you'll see is, well, we've had some reductions too, I guess. Gas, we've gone to hybrid vehicles. We just got our first shipment of those. We've got 3 of them. We got a 4th one on the way, and then there's obviously 3 more in this current budget that I'm asking for as well. It's hard. Sorry, it's hard to kind of go back and forth while having this up and then trying to get into things. But I've reduced a couple things. You're gonna see that there's a $30,000 reduction, and that's the school resource officer. School currently gives $30,000 only for that position. It costs triple that. And obviously there's been some reductions to provide some funds to go towards the school budget, which we knew about. And I just, that's part of it, my reduction.
Okay, thanks, Chief. That's a really good start.
I also have the other 2 budgets, obviously, but they're a little easier to explain.
Yeah, we'll go through them one at a time.
Sounds good.
So let's see. What did I had a couple questions? You're still down a couple officers, is that right? And trying to hire based on hoping that civil service will help you out there.
We have one that is kind of hung up right now that we've appointed but haven't started officially paying yet, but it's in our current budget because the academy got suspended due to the COVID. They are hoping to restart that next week and be done by April 26th, I believe, because they were almost there when that happened. And that will put us at essentially full staffing momentarily until potential retirements come into place. But promotional and things like that are hung up right now because of the civil service and waiting to get out of that.
Good. Do other committee members have questions for Chief Haig? Councilor DeSorger.
Hi there.
Hi, Jenny. How are you?
Good. Thanks for all you're doing.
Oh, good to see you again.
So I just had I had 2 questions, And this was on money that possibly might be left over. I know we're going to have a lot of extra expenditures.
Yeah, absolutely.
Trust me. Well, I don't even have any idea what they would be, but I can imagine. So for your fiscal year 2020, the gas expense and the court overtime expense. The gas has been, significantly, the cost of that has gone down specifically, and I don't think that we're going to court as much right now. Would there be any savings from that you might be able to push over to fiscal 2021? And this is my first year on Ways and Means. I don't know that that's even appropriate that I'm asking about the last year into this year. And also, while everyone's on the line,
as far as pushing forward, I don't think that's how it works. But as far as turning back and then deciding where it goes after that, that's kind of on your plate. Right now, so much like Chief Strahan, he and I started talking about potential issues coming up before even January 1. We start talking about that regardless of COVID. We start looking at where our shortfalls are going to be, where we start talking about freezing certain expenditures, things like that. And that's usually about halfway through the year, regardless of what we're going through right now. We were extremely tight coming into this year. So we, I've been looking at it pretty tightly from January on. I've just had to freeze things a whole lot quicker than I planned on. Most of those things that you're seeing right now, the reason that there's so much left in court right now is they stopped doing court hearings in January. Where you're looking at the gas, we're down a tremendous amount of cruisers, never mind the fact that we're not, the gas is expensive right now, obviously for obvious reasons. But when you're down cruisers, you're then driving those other cars 24 hours a day for every shift. They're not getting breaks and they're costing you more on the maintenance side. So if you look at my maintenance, I'm already out of that for the whole year. That's what happens when you don't have a good plan. It's just reality of that. So right now I'm looking at anything that I have left over right now in any of those accounts that are on that top half especially. That's going to fund the overtime that we're going to be out at the rate we're going right now in 2 weeks. The general overtime, just because of obvious reasons for that. So unfortunately, we're going to have to be shifting line to line within, top and bottom to make it through that. Gas is always just a guess for us, to be honest with you, Councilor. Some years it's good. Some year the prices are down. Some year the prices are up. It's one of those things that we can't really gauge, but we did cut some of that out going into next year, just in hopes that the hybrid vehicles that we have coming, because hours of use is more what we look at, and the hours of use when your car is running with gas is different than hopefully these hours of use that will be running off a battery until they have to start rolling again. So that's why that cut was there. This year, I have to be honest with you, I'm like everybody else. I'm crossing my fingers. There's going to be certain things that we're down. I can tell you that our call volume, while on paper you'd think it was down, the time-consuming part of that is not down. It's actually gone the other direction, as I'm sure that Chief Strahan will agree with me. The types of calls we're going on right now are more serious calls. They take more officers, and now we're taking way more precautions in other ways that sometimes aren't as safe. So we'd actually rather have more officers than not. We're holding prisoners. We've never done that, and since I've been here in 6 years, we've always had the sheriff's department. They're obviously under different restrictions as well through the state. So we're keeping prisoners right now for the entire county, because most county PDs are part-time and they don't have 24 hours, to have people there. And we need to kind of pick up what we're doing for the community as well. And that's just one of them. So when you're talking about that, you now have people in the building all the time, getting them out to do voice court appearances is an absolute nightmare. The court's not taking anybody either, which means you get domestics are up and 209As are up. These are the things that unfortunately are costing the money on the other end.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chief Haig. That was good, worthwhile question and good discussion. Director Gilman, did you have something to add to that?
Not to the police chief, but after he's through his budget, I think it would help everyone to understand how the COVID FEMA reimbursement works, because I think it would help you understand the budget issues in relation to both chiefs' budget.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Director. that will help.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very, very good idea, Director Gilman, and I'll try to make a note to do that in between. Councillor Forgy, you have a question?
Thank you. Chief, you mentioned in your report about accreditation for the police department,
Yep.
which actually is very exciting, and congratulations on doing that.
It's only been 28 years in the making.
There you go. Hey, we all need a reward, right? I wonder if you could just briefly tell us what that is,
Sure.
and in the scheme of things, how important is that to keep?
Okay, sure. So one of the things about accreditation is it's not mandatory. So I don't want to like fake anybody out and say it's mandatory. We have to have this. But what it does is it basically demonstrates that you have a professional agency. We are using and proving that we are using the best practices in the nation and for our state. And it helps with liability. There is a reduction in insurance. I mean, there's obviously, I wouldn't say it's going to balance out, obviously, for what you have to spend to keep it. But what it does is it's something that keeps our agency, which in my opinion, being the biggest in Franklin County, and quite honestly, we're the first in Franklin County to get it, and one of only 4 in Western Mass. It proves that we are doing what we say we're doing. It's an accountability for the community. It keeps us on a training schedule that is not just basic, it's on and above. We have much more checks and balances internally for ourselves and our officers. It's an easier sell when we go to court and somebody says, well, what's your practice for this? Well, this is what it is, and we have proof that we've been doing that. It's an independent review every 3 years. But it's not something you can wait 3 years and then try to catch up on 3 years just because you know they're showing up. It's actually changing a little bit, and this was I don't know where it stands right now with everything that's going on, but they were going to start backdooring into your system and spot checking you throughout the years now, where you can't just hide things for 3 years and then hope to fix them before you go for it again. It also puts the community kind of in a joint responsibility with us, because it does require funding to maintain properly adequate cruisers and equipment and up-to-date firearms and tasers and the basic equipment that we use every day. But more, it's how are we doing our job every day with the community, and what are we doing to prove that we're doing what we say? And to me, that's the most important thing. Especially with policing now, with the credibility, it's part of why we got the cameras. We the amount of complaints where we can go back now and look at a camera, and we've had some, and say, no, that's not what happened, or yeah, you're right, that's what happened. And to me, that's a very important thing for us to have in conjunction with the community as a whole. And I would hope, because it's not easy to achieve at all, that the community would want to make sure they have the most professional agency working for them.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Chief, and thanks for that question, Councillor Forgy. It really sounds like holds the police to a higher standard to be accredited, and we should be proud of it.
And we should be held to that standard as well. I mean, that's important. So.
Right. Absolutely. Let's see. Other questions for the chief about the police operating budget? I had a really brief one. I saw the cost of uniforms. Well, it went up. You didn't get quite your requested amount, but I assume that you're on a rotating schedule with body armor and uniforms there.
We are, but unfortunately, not everybody's on the same schedule. So that's one of the things there. So we've replaced, I think, probably 3/4 of the department with vests. A few of us we didn't get because well, quite honestly, I'm not as important as the person that's actually out there doing the job. So for a few of us, it was, we had to kind of take a step back and make sure that we gave the people that are really out there on the front lines what they need. So we do have some that are not up to date yet. And we have some that just got hired that we need to, that we knew that we were hiring newly that we would need to get outfitted as well. There's also startup costs that are not union contractual startup costs for their person, but they are part of their contract that we have to outfit them, and that costs obviously startup money. But we also have other units now that we haven't had before, and some of these are, I'll be honest with you, some of them are accreditation stuff too. If you're going to have them, you have to do things. Like if you want to have a bike patrol, you've got to make sure they're trained and outfitted correctly. You want to have an SRT team, you've got to make sure that they're outfitted and trained properly. K9 is only so many things are part of that grant. You got to make sure that those things are there. So that's why there's some additional costs that have come in. Part of that as well is the TASER contract, which comes up every year. I've been trying to pay ahead on that, but that's another thing that we can't let lapse, and that did lapse before. We can't let that ever happen again. So, and that payment's not cheap. I have to be honest with you, it's just not cheap. And the program that we're on, we've changed because we felt it was a waste of money, because you could always buy some at the end. Well, at the end, they're not actually taking care of that model anymore because they got the new model. So we're trying to do everything up front, take care of it in advance, and make sure that we have the proper equipment every 3 to 7 years with tasers.
Great, thanks. Let's see. Any further questions on operating? We're also going to move to capital because the chief does have a couple capital items this year, but I want to make sure that we talk through the operating budget first.
Sure.
Ask you about the career incentive line item. Could you just explain to counselors what that is?
Certainly. Prior to 2009, it was called the Quinn Bill. That's probably what people remember in their head. The Quinn Bill prior to 2009, if you were a full-time police officer and you had either your associates, your bachelor's, or your master's, or were in the process of getting one of those going past 2009, that was agreed upon in their contract that they would receive what the Quinn Bill benefits were at that time, which was 10%, 20%, and 25% respectively. After 2009, officers that were hired, they get something. I believe it's 10% for an associate's and 12% for a bachelor's and master's, and that's the people after 2009. That is what that figure is. It's off your base pay, which also includes your holiday, your longevity, as well as one other, which I believe is like when you work holidays, the hours change. So it's not a completely finite number, but it's pretty close to that every year.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the number based on what they're going to be making off of all those categories.
Right. Great. Thanks for that. Explanation. I think the Greenfield PD is a really professional force, and education is definitely part of that.
As we keep retiring, that number should actually go backwards because of all of us old guys are getting out of the job. So.
All right. Any further questions on operating before we move over to capital? Okay. I'm not seeing any. We can always come back to it if we think of something else. So capital is, I'm not actually sure that it's in the budget book. Well, it probably is, but I didn't write the page numbers down. So I'm going to give everyone a minute or two to find the pages that you need. But police only has 2 capital items this year, so we can probably just talk about them. And
yeah, I can run them off for you, Counselor, if you'd like.
Yeah, why don't we start there?
So we put in for the 2 that were pushed through to your committee. Was a command post trailer and signboards. And the signboards are a little bit more simple, so I'll deal with those. We don't have one. The one that you see around town for different things, that's actually the sheriff's department, and we try to poach it whenever we can. Doesn't necessarily always happen. This is for 2 that would actually have not only speed, but also a message ability. So it could be used for exactly that, elections. It could be used for road closures. I know the DPW often, we're not putting police officers out with the DPW, but they need a road closure. These things could be used for them as well. Detour signs, things like that, messaging. But we also get a lot of asks for the speed trailer. that despite what everybody thinks, that thing has been gone since my second year here. It's an old battery one. It didn't keep a charge anymore. The winters were brutal with it, and those batteries are about $200 a piece, and it's really just kind of an archaic piece of equipment. So we would be using that for that as well. They'd be solar powered. That's I've put in for this in the past a few times, and we've tried to work it into different places, but we find the need for those quite a bit, and we just don't have them right now. We can only put a speed counter on a road for so long, and nobody even knows what it is. It's a box against a tree, and then we can't do much after that. But these would be invisible type of signs, small enough for us to tow with a regular cruiser and not have to borrow the sheriff's every time.
All right, thanks. So let's take questions on that before talking about the other one. I think I certainly support this. It's a relatively small expenditure. I think even in a state of emergency with a lot less traffic on the roads, you still see people speeding. Probably for that reason, it's almost like a racetrack out there. But so I definitely see the need. Director Warner, do you want to speak just briefly? This would be a useful, the DPW would get some use out of this as well, you think?
Well, the chief and I talked about this early on. Part of my traffic safety improvement plan is 2 mobile sign type units. So we kind of put our heads together. His will be a multifunction signboard as well as speed, but we'll also, if that capital on my end is approved, we'll have 2 mobile signs we can move around the different areas of the town. So form like a tripod, if you will, on the different complaints, if you will, or the requests for speeding.
Thanks for that. I'm just going to interrupt briefly to say that we have a quorum of the council logged in, which is great. I love to see it. But just a reminder that councilors who are not on Ways and Means, please keep your microphones muted and don't use the chat box. We don't want to avoid we want to avoid open meeting law violations. Councilor Elmer, you have a question?
Yeah, no, I was just going to point out that the page number is 164 in the budget book.
Thanks for that. Okay. Any Councilor DeSorger?
This is just a comment. I totally approve of that expenditure, but as far as messages that need to be given right now, the new board that we have in front of the high school, with all that we have going on right now, I had just hit this is kind of off topic a little bit, but not really. That just as of today, we're asking everybody to wear masks. That came out from the mayor's office. And there has been nothing on that board since school has been out of session, and that perhaps that could be used in the meantime. Just my thought.
Thanks for the suggestion, Councilor DeSorger. Any further questions or comments on the trailer? I'm going to let the mayor respond to that, actually, if you'd like.
Thank you for that, Jenny. I just want everybody to know I didn't pay her for that. I was thinking a great use of that because it wasn't that long ago, like yesterday, that 4 to 5 to 7 or 8 messages on email, as well as phone calls, was about reminding people to wear their masks. So it's a great opportunity, would be a great opportunity to do that and move it around town, since it obviously can be, according to the chief, towed on the back of a cruiser. So, but more than that, I would say on a regular basis, we really do get lots of requests for speed notifications on all kinds of residential streets all over Greenfield. So it survived my red pin for that reason only.
Thank you, Mayor. Any further questions on the speed trailer before we move on to the next? All right, seeing none. Chief, you want to talk about the command trailer?
Certainly. So if anybody's seen the one that we've used at different locations over the last few years, you might look at it, but you don't want to step inside it. There's almost no floorboards left. I'm pretty sure that was around when I was here my first time back in '99. I think I see Councilor Ford shaking her head. So I think it was here that long ago. And that even at that point, I'm not even sure it was new then. But it was a retrofitted trailer, and it served a great purpose for us. We use it at different locations at the fair, and we use it. Now we're using it at Wormtown, and in this case, we'd probably be using it somewhere right now if we had something that was viable. But at the last Wormtown, we got very lucky, and MEMA didn't have anybody using theirs, and we did ask them for it. And wow, what an unbelievable piece of equipment! So we started doing just some research at that point, because the one we have now, it's really, really bad. We put it out, and I kind of said, give me something that we're going to use for a very long time, but don't go crazy with everything in it. But these things are used where we have our equipment and our radios in it. It really is a mobile police station. And if you have enough events here in Greenfield, and barring any natural disasters, which we always have a couple of here and there, we've had a couple of issues where we've needed to move some equipment around and had an off-site coordination with fire and some other things. We just don't have anything right now. And this would be something that would be in existence for as long as anybody around here probably will be working for my department. I mean, these aren't something that you have a 5-year turnaround. These are things that you can have for 20 years if you take care of them. This particular amount of money, though, and the trailer we're looking at, it's specifically built for this type of thing. This isn't buying a camper that we're going to retrofit, that we physically will buy and outfit from a company that does this for a living. And we just have never had that. We've done really well with what we have, but this one is less like it.
Okay, thanks for that, Chief. I think just the fact that we're in an emergency right now ought to be reason enough for why we need that. Councilor Forgy, you have a question?
I do. On some of these capital projects, I'm assuming that that we will be seeking other monies than general fund expenditure. This might be for the two chiefs. For instance, grants. Is there any sort of public safety grants or special funds that are being offered to offset any of your costs this fiscal year?
Oh boy, this fiscal year.
Well, but while you think on that, Chief, can I just jump in to note that this trailer, I think you already mentioned it, does have what is it, $90,000 coming from a FEMA reappropriation? Am I correct about that?
That's not for me. No,
But
that's not part of it. That's not part of
The
it.
answer is yes.
See, we have a creative finance director, and she takes care of the money, and so she'll find you money in places you don't even expect it. I'm going to let
I didn't know about it.
speak on this.
So this is way left over from Hurricane Irene.
Oh, all right. You're talking about that then. Okay. I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about current
By the
grant.
time we cleaned it up, it was like, it's ancient.
Mhm.
And it has to go to capital because there was a bond authorization with that disaster. So any leftover funds in that particular one must be at capital with a useful life of, around 20 years or more.
You threw a curveball at me. That's not what they asked.
Sorry. Well, back then it was like, we should clean this up. It seemed appropriate that FEMA funds went to emergency department.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
Okay, great. Any further questions for Chief Haig?
Just to answer Councilor Forgy, I got to be honest with you. A lot of the grants for aren't out there right now. Phil Wartell has done a great job for me over the last few years. Obviously, he's down to procurement now, but we've looked at a bunch of grants. We put in for a bunch of grants, and we've come in second for a bunch of grants. We're we're in one of those unique positions. Who knows after this year, but that we're always seem to be well off enough to not qualify for that competitive #1 spot on those grants. We lost to Chelsea twice in the last like 4 years. So we do keep looking for them, and we will continue to look for them.
Okay, thanks, Chief. So unless there's any further questions on the police operating or capital budget, we're going to move on to dispatch at this point. Anything you'd like to tell us about where dispatch is at right now, Chief?
Yep. Dispatch is one. I just want to thank the dispatchers for doing what they're doing right now, because they're not really seen out there, but they are taking on a ton of calls and a ton of workload. And they've been fairly short-staffed. We are fully staffed with 10 people, but we've had to train somebody that had never done the job before, and really getting thrown into this off of kind of probation right now is amazing. So our people that have got him trained up and ready to go, I really thank them. They've done a phenomenal job. We're at 10 right now. The budget next year is set for 10. We put in for the 911 grants at the beginning of the year. They're not necessarily set in stone. That's always it's always a gamble. We know we're going to get something. You just never know what really the final dollar is until you actually get it, but you start the year without it. So I budget at what I need to start the year. You always see that my overtime ends up being exceptionally low, and we spend exceptionally high on that. With dispatch having only 10, you only have one person to move around when people are off. So that tends to not really work. We tend to not have 10 people most of the time. We've gone, since my 6 years of being here, I think probably only 2 to 3 of them we've had actually 10 bodies that are able to work. It's a high stress job, and you usually get about a 50% turnover rate of people that stay and go. 50% are career, 50% tend to be here. And it's not just me. I mean, this is across dispatch, period. They're here for 1 to 3 years. A lot want to go into law enforcement. A lot don't want to be in it after they've been in it for a few years. It's a high burnout. So the overtime tends to be way more than what I budget for, and we end up having to augment that once grants come in and that kind of thing. So what you're seeing there is I don't budget the overtime high, and I cross my fingers. And we've been okay with it. I mean, you'll also see there's really no expense lines for dispatch. That comes out of the police department. When computers break in there, and that happens a lot, the police department pays for those computers. Equipment goes down in there, whether it's the printers, the phone lines, anything else, the police department picks up the tab for that. So I don't budget for that. Intentionally, I keep that low, but that does come out of us at the end of the day. But really, we started taking Cell 911 a couple years ago, which has been really good. Picks up the call volume, but then also increased the funding that comes to Greenfield. And we've seemed to get by with kind of asking for this really bare bones, or just our people and a low end on the overtime. And then when things roll in, we shift it over. You'll also see there's no training money there. We do train our people. Everybody's 16 hours a year minimum. But we put that through the training grant, and that's just a reimbursable grant. So you'll see it run in the red once in a while, but we do get reimbursed for 90% of the training. The only time we don't get reimbursed for it is if it's something outside of the scope of the 911 service, which we do on occasion. We do have a dispatch supervisor that might do a different kind of training. We might have senior dispatchers go for a little extra training to be able to deal with other situations. But for the most part, that training gets picked up by the state for their 16 hours. So that's why we have a 0 line in that. Mileage line in that, we've lowered it as well, because we try to do as much as we can locally, but also we let them take one of our unmarked protective vehicles to training, so that cuts out kind of the mileage issue if we can do that. Obviously, sometimes when we're low, we can't, but that's why you've seen that number decrease over the years as well.
Great. Thanks, Chief. Yeah, it looks like, it amounts to a level funded budget, basically.
It's covering the salary increases, and that's really it. I think I kept everything else pretty much the same as the year before. And if you look back the last few years, I've done the same thing.
Yeah, so, if anything, there's some decreases, right? Like what you just talked about. So
new people, new people always. We hope to keep a few, but you never know.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
They do a great job, though. They do a great job.
Yeah. Any questions from counselors on dispatch? I will, I guess, just jump in to say that, questions about long-range capital projects are also appropriate. And I was just thinking about this because dispatch, hopes to be co-located in a public safety complex. And I know that as a counselor, getting police into a new station, be it hopefully a public safety complex, or if need be a standalone, is a priority of mine. So
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I just wanted counselors to know that is something that the Capital Improvements Committee, had lengthy discussion on. The chief had a third capital item, lockers, which I certainly saw the need for, but there seemed to be some flexibility around it not making sense to purchase them now if there's a possibility for a station. That right,
Can I
Chief?
just address? Yeah, can I just address something based on what you just said, Counselor? And thank you for that.
Absolutely.
There are accreditation issues that we are going to have with our building in 3 years. I can't tell you certain costs, but I can tell you that some of it is security issues that we have, and I obviously won't go into those publicly. But there are certain things that the building is going to need if we're going to get reaccredited. We worked really hard to kind of explain how it's going and what we're doing our best to do to secure certain things, and this is how we handle these things. But we do know that the standards have changed. That's why we work so hard to get in right now, because the standards are changing always, but they were specifically going to a new accreditation standard process. So when we get reaccredited in 3 years, we're gonna have to meet those. And the building is definitely one of those things that we have some issues with. We have some major issues with our booking room. Dispatch is also going to be one of those issues. Right now, we're dispatch, even though I'm their supervisor, they're a separate department. That's, one of those things that we kind of had to negotiate out for, because they are directly in our building. They have direct access to our building, but they're in a secure room. That room is a closet. And once we decided to go to an accreditation standard and we're securing them in there with the door closed, that is a very, very small room for those of you who have been in our station. But so there's some things that we're going to have to look forward to with the building if we're going to stay in this building. Hopefully we're not, but I try to be realistic about things, and the dispatch center will be one of those major costs if this is a long-term plan for us to remain there.
Chief, any follow-up questions from counselors? Okay, seeing none, we're going to move on to Chief Haig's favorite, parking.
Love parking. Love my parking people.
Yeah,
they work hard. They work hard, and everything they do is unfortunately doesn't make people happy. But they're hardworking people.
I know they are. I was parking in the garage for most of the last year until I stopped leaving my house, and they've definitely been doing good work, along with, I think, DPW helping out with some of the technical difficulties, and IT obviously. So I've appreciated that. Any questions on the parking budget? Well, looks like we may have lost the chief for a moment. So I can't tell. All right, Chief, are you there?
I think
No.
you
He's
lost
having a
him.
low bandwidth problem, Councilor
Yeah.
Wheeler.
Yep. So we'll give that a minute. Actually, I have a question for the mayor. If Mayor Wiedegartner is nearby.
I am.
It's just about parking. It's your favorite thing to field questions on.
Everyone's favorite. Yeah.
I just thought, since we were talking about it, would you remind me, is ticketing paused during the state of emergency?
Yes. It is. It definitely is. I mean, I think if you'll recall from last night's meeting, we discussed the fact that parking revenues are down. They're running at only, Liz can help me with that too if she's hearing this, $70,000 off the normal budget. Or the normal amount of revenue. I was speaking to the chief about this today, and he said it generally runs around $15,000 a month in terms of revenue. So at the end of next month, we could easily be at $100,000 down. So all the more reason, I hate to say it, but there's good news and bad news about opening up our streets and our economy, and one of them is more parking revenue. But that's not what I was going to say. Funnily enough, I did have a nice conversation with Danny today, and I said that, among other things, besides fighting COVID-19, we need to get a handle back. I mean, one of our major projects for the spring was to get a handle on parking and how we could make it less onerous, but as equally as beneficial to us from a revenue standpoint as possible. And fixing the parking garage was high on that list. And I can tell you that everyone from dispatch to DPW to the police department in general wants that to happen, to get the parking garage filled on a regular basis. So, but for now, yes, we disbanded ticketing. And we're only on the streets, and I don't even know, that is a question for Chief at this point, if how much they're out there right now. But they were there to, in essence, quote unquote, police the people trying to park in handicap zones and stuff like that. Those are the only tickets they're giving out.
Right. Safety concern type thing, blocking entrances. Yeah.
And he would tell you that he is down one person, and I don't recall what the reason for that is.
Okay.
Plus we have one person in the EOC.
Got it. Okay. Thanks for that. Thanks for pinch hitting there. I don't see the chief. Maybe parking. I brought up the word parking, and he decided to. But we were actually pretty much all the way through his budgets, so I don't think it's a problem. If anyone does have any remaining questions on parking that the mayor or Director Gilman could answer, we could field those now. Councilor Elmer.
I was kind of surprised when the passport system finally worked, and I wanted to use it for a 5-minute parking to find that it doubled the cost. It's a 10-cent fee every time you use it. So keep those quarters.
Yeah, the quarters are still worth money. All right. So before we move on to fire, I think I'm going to let Director Gilman go into a little bit around FEMA reimbursement, and maybe it would also make sense, Director, to talk a tiny bit about departmental turnbacks, because we had the question, I think Councilor DeSorger asked a question about, would a certain department's line item come in under the budgeted number, and could that money be used next year? But of course, any excess that goes unspent is a departmental turnback that can be requested. Correct, it has to be requested by the mayor's office and approved by council. Is that correct?
No, transfer would.
Transfer.
A turnback is what will end up in your free cash, basically. So in a way, depending on how you utilize free cash, it can go toward some of the COVID expenses, you know? But I did want to speak a little bit about this because I think it'll help people understand the general fund budgets for police and fire in relationship to the FEMA. When the governor declared a state of emergency, there's a mass general law that allows us to spend in excess of appropriations. This happened with Irene. They give you guidance to set up a special account that you charge the FEMA eligible expenses to, because you're going to get 75% reimbursed, but it's not going to come in right now. So they allow you to run a deficit in that account. They have issued further guidance that the deficit will be allowed to be amortized over 3 years without being detrimental to the city. So if it cost $150,000, $50,000 each year would have to be reduced or go on the recap to be raised as a deficit, not the whole 150. And this is only as you're waiting for the FEMA reimbursement to come in. And so the FEMA covers 75%, and the city would be obligated for the remaining 25%. So this is where I think, you know, we can vote free cash to cover a part of the deficit in that fund if departments can turn back funds. And we also, even if we can't cover it at the time, we are allowed to temporarily borrow, so it doesn't have to get raised on the recap. So it's kind of like this fine dance. I look at it to where, okay, how much of the 25% am I running up, and what's available in the general fund? So it'll be, I'm pretty confident, like right now, through the end of April, we're at 132,000 projected through the end of April, and 17,120 of that is a state COVID grant that we received, emergency funds. So it's actually less, you know, that will be eligible for FEMA. And you cannot, one other thing I want you to understand too is you can't apply for the FEMA until you've hit 131,000. So we are looking at that, and it is a lot of work to get this all set up. We had to get additional permission from the Bureau of Accounts to run the deficit. It's letting them know that we intend to do this, and they gave us permission, as every other city and town in the state of Massachusetts is doing. So it isn't being run up necessarily, the FEMA eligible is not being necessarily run up as a deficit in the general fund. That's what I would want you to kind of put your head around, because we know 75% is coming back. So that's why they let you segregate it out in this other fund.
Mm-hmm.
Do anybody have questions on that? Because I know it's confusing. I tried to say it.
It's a really helpful explanation, though, and I'll take questions in just a moment. I just want to update the chief. I see the chief's back. Chief, we did have 1 or 2 questions on parking. The mayor was able to answer them, and so I let Director Gilman go into talking about FEMA reimbursement. And I'm going to come back in a moment just in case we have any last questions about parking.
Okay.
And before I take a question, I'm going to let the mayor speak. Mayor, did you want to jump in here? I think it was the mayor. It may have been.
Yeah, it was me. It was me, and I'm now unmuted, I think, right?
Okay. Yes, you are.
Okay, wonderful. I just wanted to add to Liz's explanation. we do have the option, and it's one that we're weighing right now, because of the expected excess expense that COVID-19 might cause us. FEMA has given us an option of expedited funding, expedited reimbursement. So we will decide at some point in the near future whether we want to get that money up front sooner, because your 75% reimbursement could be several years out, which is why they allow you under the new thing that Liz was talking about to amortize it over a couple of 3 years. So just at the expedited, it's only a 50% reimbursement, but we do get that money back sooner. At the rate we're going now, and I think both chiefs would agree with me, we are not what I would call, as Liz pointed out, in a super danger zone. 132,000 when we were expecting 400,000 to 500,000 at the end of this is pretty good. So we may go for the 75-25 instead, but we don't know that yet. But that is an option out there as well.
All right. Thanks for that, Mayor. Councilor DeSorger, did you have your hand up earlier?
I did. Two things. Can you, Liz, Director Gilman, can you, where did that 17,000, where was that coming from? That's part one of my question.
That was state emergency funds FERCog actually distributed it to all the communities. So it's a special revenue fund for COVID expenses.
Okay, thank you.
I can tell you it's also being utilized for additional nursing expenditures.
Great.
Yep.
And secondly, you said that we would get 75%, or if 75% reimbursement from FEMA, as long as we get up to $131,000 that we are needing from this pandemic. How does that work as far as the repurposing of our own staff from one department to another in the Emergency Operations Center? Like if we have staff from another department that's coming in to work in emergency operations, because I think we want to get to 130.
That could possibly be, but the police chief and the fire chief have been through this before, and they know how they have to track the expenditures for staff. And so they do it weekly. And the overtime, direct overtime, and then someone who was hired specifically for the operations center. So it isn't somebody's regular base salary. It's only the forced overtime. And then someone who was hired specifically for an emergency COVID operations center. So it's not the percentage of, say, the chief's salary, or not a percentage of, if that's what you're thinking. No?
No, what I actually meant was the staff from other departments, i.e. park. I mean, I've been down, had my wonderful tour, and they're doing a fantastic job, absolutely fantastic, at the Emergency Operations Center.
Oh.
So I was looking at our expenditures. I'm well aware that you know we had increased nursing staff as we voted on that last night. But what I have seen down there is I used the word repurposing, but it's actually people from other departments, which is wonderful that they're there. But how does that work as far as the finance part? Because we have to look at all of that.
Right. Well, the chief can correct me but my understanding is we would have been paying them anyway, and they aren't being, they couldn't do particular positions. So
I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, yeah, I was just going to say, Liz, Sorry about that. I think I'm a little delayed from you. Yeah, essentially, our parking enforcement who would have otherwise either been home using their own time or really out doing something that right now we need a more important role within our particular agency. She's still coming to work every day, working her hours. We're just using her in a different manner. So there's no really offset of what we would have been paying her had she been downtown, collecting or issuing tickets or, checking parking lots when that's really off the table right now. So there's a lot of people that are just being utilized in different manners that they've never done before, just for this particular situation. When it comes to overtime, I think that's part of what you're talking about, the funding for it. If I have 3 officers who go out because they've either come in contact, we think that they're symptomatic or something due to this COVID experience, and they're not working and I have to fill their positions, that particular overtime is what we're going to be putting in for reimbursement. Because specifically we needed to fill those positions because of this pandemic. If that helps at all.
That, I get it. Thank you.
So, Council, can I jump in for a second?
Please do, Chief Strand.
So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a blueprint of where we started and where we're at today. And so, the money that Liz mentioned, the anticipated amount that we're projecting out, that includes fire and police overtime that has already occurred, as well as the weekly costs, including the cost to run the EOC and the cost of our folks that we had to hire that had special expertise in a health emergency. And so that's all included in that. I will say that when we started meeting very early on, the week we decided to open up the EOC, and Liz can correct me if I'm wrong, we put out an emergency expenditure only to all departments within the city, knowing that we were going to have some complications, and our projections at the time were between 500,000 and 750,000, and the fact that we're not even at the $100,000 mark right now is a pretty good accomplishment, and that's primarily because we're only using a few contractors, and the rest are paid staff within the city. And so they've just been repurposed to the EOC. We will be tracking all, I know the school has some volunteers that they have, and some other things like that will actually contribute to the 25% match for the federal government. So it's a complicated equation, but I'll remind everybody, when Irene hit, the city of Greenfield, the city itself suffered $15 million worth of damages that we had to pay for right along. And we ended up getting the money back, but this isn't the first time we've had an emergency. And yes, this is different because there's an economic impact and whatnot, but the cost of this emergency is high for me. 150,000, or where we're projecting out, is still high, but it's nowhere clear to where we've been in past emergencies.
Thanks, Chief. I think it's instructive at this time to just think about what we're doing in crafting a budget, which is to anticipate the normal costs of running the city, and that the state of emergency we're in is really an aberration. It's abnormal, but we have, as the both chiefs and Director Gilman just said, we have processes identified and ways to fund emergency expenses, and likewise there are processes when we have savings because of the emergency. So I think it's really good to talk all of this out, but ultimately we're still budgeting for what we hope will eventually be a normal FY21. Do we, let's see, have any further questions for Chief Haig before we can let him go? I'm not seeing any. Thank you so much, Chief, for everything tonight. We'll look forward to seeing you again on May 7th when we do our final deliberations. We'd appreciate having you there in case there's further questions. All right, thanks. Good night. Okay, so at this point, we're going to call back Chief Strachan, and we're going to move on to Fire's operating budget, which is on page 96 of your budget book. So, do you want to give a brief overview of the department and how it would be operating if these were somewhat normal times?
Sure.
Chief?
So I will go ahead and tell you what I submitted for our budget, and obviously because there's only a big enough pie for everybody, we had to scale back a little bit on it. But I originally put in for a request to restore the deputy chief within the fire department and 4 additional firefighters that we've been down for many years. Last year, 2019, was our busiest year ever. We did just under 3,000 calls. To give you some perspective on that, when I first got on the department, we were running about 800 to 900. And we had 7 men on a shift back then, and my goal is to hopefully restore. We have made some significant progress in regards to staffing within the last couple years. The biggest one is we have a manning now within the department that we have 5 firefighters on duty at all the time. What that gives me is a 3-man engine company and a 2-man or a 2-person, I should say, second piece, which is either an ambulance or a second engine. So we reduced, like I said, the deputy chief and the 4 positions. And so the positions that are funded in the budget are existing positions within the department. And the makeup of the department right now is a chief, me. I have 6 captains, 4 captains assigned to shift, 1 captain assigned to fire prevention, and the 4th one is actually assigned to the EOC right now, but will be assigned to days. Our goal is within the next few years to bump one of the captains up to a deputy chief and take it in steps rather than having the whole cost of a big position like that happen. And that also includes 4 lieutenants and 16 firefighters, a dozen call firefighters, an administrative assistant, and a part-time administrative assistant to assist fire prevention. In the budget. So that's from our salary side of things. You want to keep going, or do you have any questions about salaries?
Why don't we take questions on salaries right now? Councillor Forgy, go ahead.
Chief, did I hear you correctly? You are removing the request for a deputy chief from this current operating budget?
Chris, we've already have done that in the budget. And so the budget narrative that's in there was my budget narrative that I submitted to the mayor at the last minute to try to keep the cost down. It had been reduced from a deputy chief to a captain. So the money that's reflected in the budget is reflected as the captain's salary, not the deputy chief.
And there will be a captain that will be appointed to serve as a second in command?
Not exactly.
Would that be like an OIC?
So the second captain on days will fill an administrative role captain. We'll do just about everything the deputy would do except the upper administrative, disciplinary action and things like that really a number 2 is needed for. But the day-to-day operational stuff that you need the deputy chief to do, this captain would fulfill that role. It's a position that we instituted a few years ago and it was removed. It's a position that we're putting back. Obviously, we still have ongoing discussions with the union about that because it is a union position, but eventually it is the goal that one of the captains will be turned into a deputy chief. funding this year did not, or the budget process this year going forward did not afford us the opportunity to go to that step yet.
Okay, I appreciate that very much, but what was the original rationale for removing it?
Cost savings.
Okay.
That's all I could say. It is very detrimental to the department not having a deputy chief, but we also are realists too, and we'll build that so that we can maintain the staff that is out on the floor. The guys that we have, that is the number one priority, is to maintain the firefighters that we have out on the floor doing the job. They've do a tremendous job. And like I said, they are very, very busy, busier than they've ever been, especially with the new role of the ambulance. They've all embraced it and do a great job. But our priority is to make sure that we've got the firefighters on the street.
Chief, thank you very much. I appreciate your honesty. And I also appreciate your cooperation in response to budget concerns. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Any further questions on salaries before we let the chief move on?
So the one item I do want to highlight, and Counselor, you're familiar with this after a few years with me going through this process, is my overtime. As we know, our overtime is always has not been funded to the levels. This funding that we have in the overtime shows an increase in it, puts it back to the more realistic number of where we anticipate the overtime to be and where it has been.
Thanks.
I just wanted to point that out because that was a pretty significant increase as well. And the big reason for the jump over the last few years with overtime is the minimum staffing. To maintain 5 firefighters or 5 personnel on a shift is absolutely necessary, but based on the staffing that we have to accomplish that, we have to do it a lot through overtime. And so that's why the overtime number is high.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that explanation. Do we anticipate, I mean, it seems like we must at some point get to the point where the addition of a deputy chief would that cancel out some of the need for overtime, or not really, because that would actually be, your hope is actually to certify a captain as deputy chief, and so that would actually not be addition
Right.
on shift.
Right. The deputy chief would have its own role. Right now, again, it's a captain that would be filling kind of quasi deputy chief right now, and that would be Monday through Friday. So we could see some minor reductions in overtime, but really to maintain 24/7 coverage, it would be an additional firefighter to each shift before you would start seeing significant reductions in the overtime.
Thanks for that. I mean, I support realistic line items, so that certainly makes sense. Let's see. So
that's my wages, salary and wages item, which makes up the majority of my budget. If there's no questions, I'll move on to the operating side. And we've pretty much held everything as steady as we can. We do have some increases in line items that is based off of 5-year averages. One of them is the vehicle maintenance. We've always been short on vehicle maintenance. Vehicle maintenance is getting higher and higher because the fleet is getting much older, which we'll address in the capital part of the budget. But as long as the fleet ages, the cost for maintenance is going to go up a lot. Other than that, we made some adjustments here or there, but there's not really a big increases within the department budget. I forgot to mention under the salaries, one of our increases that we're holding on to is our training. When I took over as chief, we had an ISO review. That's an insurance evaluation, which affects everybody's insurance in the town. And we took some hits on staffing. We took some hits on training specifically. We've increased our minimum staffing on duty, and we've held firm with the overtime for training, and we've been able to provide firefighters with training. And I'm happy to report that the first indication is we're dropping a point on our insurance. And so everybody in the community should see a very slight decrease in their insurance. Our commercial businesses should see a bigger increase if this happens in the insurance. But things within our budget that are funded have ramifications if they're not, one of them being our insurance rate within the city of Greenfield. So I just wanted to highlight that the work that the firefighters have done in changing things and priorities within the budget for the last 6 or 7 years is paying off in small amounts, but it's starting to pay off.
Thanks, Chief. I think we're really proud of the way that the fire department works within the budgetary constraints. Mayor, did you have something to add?
I don't know. Did I look like I did?
Oh, I thought you had your hand up at one point.
No. I was getting the hair out of my eyes, but I will applaud what he just said. We had discussions about where we could cut in the chief's budget, and I said no, absolutely not. We would never cut training unless we absolutely had to. And the rationale that he just gave is precisely why. First of all, it's good to have well-trained police and fire. It is always a priority of mine when I can support it, to have that happen.
Thanks. Councillor DeSorger, did you have a question or a comment?
Just a comment. So Chief, thank you for all you're doing. And with this is on the wages and salary and the second overtime. You feel now that this budget reflects that you'll have adequate staffing for the markedly increased number of calls that you're doing annually, other than having a deputy chief. You're happy with that?
So I have been submitting the last 5 years to get back to the minimum staffing of at least 7 firefighters on a shift. I am not going to say that. Let me rephrase that. I'm happy to hold on to what we have, okay. and obviously there's different agencies or different folks in town competing for the same resources. And our concern right now is maintaining the firefighters we have. We are pursuing other avenues to try to get to that minimum. There are grants available. We have applied for the last couple of years to receive them. We have not been successful. About 5 or maybe even longer, 7 years ago, we were successful in getting that grant once. And so we'll keep going after it that way. And again, our overtime is high, so we can try to maintain, the minimum staffing that we have.
Okay.
Thanks for that. Councillor Elmer, you have a question?
Yes. Could you explain why there's such it sounded like a 3 or 4-fold increase in the number of calls from hundreds to thousands a year?
There's multiple reasons. So back when I first got on the fire department, we primarily did fire calls, where there was something burning in fire calls. The mission of the fire service has really changed over the years, and now we incorporate emergency medical, hazardous materials, specialty rescue, and we take a lot more responsibilities within the community. So, for example, one of the services that we weren't doing for a long time is that if somebody had a flooded basement and they needed assistance with removing some of the water, that's a service that we have provided that we didn't before. And the emergency calls are just way up. And like I said, we've taken on a very big role in the emergency medical services within town. We now have 2 ambulances. We run as a backup ambulance to our local provider, but that is increasingly busier and busier as we go. When we first started the service, we were anticipating doing about 100 to 120 calls a year. We're up to about 500 calls now with our ambulance, which doesn't sound like a lot, but remember, we're a backup. One of the plus sides to that is when we transport someone, we collect for that. And so the money that's collected for the ambulance transports goes back into run the ambulance program. Unfortunately, it's not enough money to put on staffing, but it's enough money to cover the EMS equipment for the department, the cost of purchasing the rigs, the cost of overtime that may be associated with that, and other costs associated with actually running an ambulance. So there has been no additional money from our budget that went into the ambulance program, and it's been pretty successful right now.
Follow-up question, Councilor Romer?
Yes, is the increased number of emergency medical calls, is that related to the opioid crisis?
So we certainly have seen an increase in calls because of the opiate crisis. Is it a significant increase over the overall medicals that we respond to? It's not. And I will remind counselors too, we do not respond to every single medical call within the city of Greenfield. We only respond on life-threatening medical calls as a first response agency. Now we have the ability to transport as well. Yeah, so the medical calls, we are an aging population in this town, which affects the amount of medical calls that we have. But we're still, most departments in the country are running about 70 to 75% medical call versus 25% fire calls. We're still running under 60% equal fire emergencies versus medical emergencies. And the fire emergencies are anything from a structure fire to a rescue call to the smells and bells calls that we like to call, when we go to an alarm or CO activation or things like that. If you sit on Main Street, you actually will hear the fire trucks running all day. It's pretty amazing how busy these firefighters are. I think the mayor will attest to that, being right on Main Street.
Both mayors will.
Thanks for that, Chief. Councilor DeSorger, you had your hand up.
I would be thinking that your increased number of calls also be a reflection of how many other local adjacent communities, fire departments are now unable to even have enough staff for their on-call fire departments. You must have an increased number of fire calls due to our mutual aid to other towns, correct?
Yeah. So mutual aid is always an interesting question that comes up at the budget. And fortunately, I usually have the numbers with me. I don't have the numbers, but I can tell you what we did the previous years. We run out of town on fire calls between 40 to 60 times a year, assisting other agencies. And that's a lot. And we have to recall firefighters every time that we do that. When we have structure fires in our town, we typically get, on average, eight communities assisting us. And so if you actually add our call volume of fires where we're actually pulling other agencies in, and one fire, again, can be 8 different agencies, we actually receive more mutual aid into the city than we give out. And so the system works, and it works well. There is a cost that goes with that, but there's also a cost with the communities assisting us. Now, our neighbors across the river over in Turner's Falls, which is another career department, they have challenges with staffing and recall just like we do. And so we've actually enhanced our ability to assist each other's agencies. So when we have a fire in town, they'll send me 2 engines with crews, and we will turn around and do the same, because we know that we are almost guaranteed the help coming from them. And so that cooperation is it has been working very well.
Thank you.
Okay. So at this point, we can take it if we have any more questions on operating. We can take those, but I'll remind us that it's 7:30 and we have a number of capital purchases to talk about. So, unless there's any further questions on operating, Chief, would you like to lay out the capital items that are on the table this year, because they are maybe just a little bit complicated in that kind of 2 trucks are maybe replaced by 1. And I want to say, from my standpoint, having sat in the Capital Improvements Committee for 2 years in a row, that I feel good about these proposed capital items, and I'm cautiously optimistic that we may have a way forward with the fire fleet, which I have to admit that maybe a year and a half ago I did not necessarily see a way forward, just because of how expensive these trucks are.
Yeah.
So I'll hand it over to you, Chief.
So it's great. So I hope everybody on the Ways and Means ended up receiving the Capital 2001 narrative specifically for apparatus replacement. If you have received the document, I'll save a lot of time, but there is an interesting chart that's in the document that spells out what vehicles need to be replaced and when they need to be replaced. And the bottom line for us is the last truck we purchased was authorized in 2014. That's engine 2. The time before that was an engine purchased in 2006. And so we've fallen pretty behind with a lot of our critical apparatus replacement. So as time moved on, I became a realist and said that, the city can't afford $600,000 engines. We can't. The replacement was going to be difficult. So we had to get creative, and we had to think of different ways on how we could do our mission, do it as good, if not better, but with limited resources that we have. And so working with the firefighters, we developed a plan, and it allows us to be more flexible, gives us more opportunities, and is also cost savings. And it almost sounds too good to be true, but I will get into the specifics on it and tell you how we're doing this. So the first one, and probably the most critical one, is the engine 3 and rescue replacement. Engine 3 is a 1993 fire engine that needed to be replaced 4 or 5 years ago. Our rescue is slated to be replaced this year. Both of those trucks, brand new, are a little over $600,000 a piece. We also have another engine that needs to be replaced. That's another $600,000. And then we have on the horizon the real big one, which is the ladder truck that should be replaced this year, but we're going to have to stretch it out another 5 years. And so, knowing all that, we had to get creative. And so what we came up with is that the replacement I'm asking for is to take engine 3 and replace it with a new engine, a larger engine than we currently have, that would serve not only the purpose of engine 3, but our heavy rescue as well. Our heavy rescue would be traded in, and the equipment off the rescue would be engineered on the new truck, where that truck would now be a dual-purpose truck, multi-purpose truck. And the cost for that is more expensive than buying an engine, but because we're combining them together, we actually save a considerable amount of money. And so the cost that we're asking for that is $710. $710 is a lot of money to in itself to try to go and ask for funding for that. So we tried to get what is the best way that we can do that. Now, engine 2 that we're running right now is a lease truck. Engine 2, we still have a few more years left on the lease truck, and the payments on that truck are about $275,000 left on what we borrowed for that truck. So the best solution that we came up working with Liz in finance was that we pay off the lease, make one more payment off of our operating budget on the current engine, pay off the remaining of that engine, get authorization to purchase a $710,000 truck. These trucks, when you build them, take over a year to build. You can't just go to a lot and pick one up and take it off. It takes about a year to build. We would lease the new truck, the $710,000 truck. We would lease that in a lease in the rears, which means the first payment's not due to a year after delivery, which would be in not this coming up budget, but the next budget. And that would roll into the line item currently within the budget. And so we wouldn't have to bond for it. You wouldn't have to borrow for it other than the lease that would be rolled into the operating budget that we currently have. So we felt that was the most economic way to do that. So what we're asking for is the payment through my operating budget, make the last payment through that, and then pay off the rest of it, which is about $275,000, which would have to be appropriated from City Council, and then City Council to authorize us to go into a lease to purchase a $710,000 truck. I do want to point out, Otis, I think you're aware of this, that the order for that says appropriated on it. You'll have to make that change.
Yes,
Okay.
I will make that motion at our budget hearing.
So really, the cost of this project is to pay off the current engine that we have. So that's the first one, and that's the most complicated one that people kind of scratch their head out when they first look at it, and then when we explain it, it really does make sense, and it really does make sense from an economic standpoint to do that. Is any questions on that one before I move on? Because the other ones are pretty self-explanatory, but this one is complicated.
Yeah, why don't we take questions on this if we have them? I feel like you've taken a page from Chief Haig's book a little bit on this one, because police, as we know, have their fleet in leases, which seems to be working out well for them. Councillor Elmer, you have your hand up?
I just want to, I'm looking at the line items, and the department requested 710,000.
Oh, may have a bandwidth issue. No, okay.
Oh.
I think I lost what the end of your question, Councillor Elmer. Would you mind repeating it? Oh, I can't.
So the question I think he was trying to get to was what the line items were. And when I did the package, it was kind of hard to put in what we were actually asking for over the cost of the project. So what really is important, and Liz can correct me if I'm wrong, is the city orders that are going forward for the appropriation of these. And those are clear. One is for $275,000 to pay off engine 2. Then the order to authorize the fire engine rescue truck lease. Remember, any lease over 3 years has to be approved by City Council. And in order for us to order the truck, we need to have that approved. But the money doesn't kick in until the next fiscal year, so you can't appropriate a fiscal year out. So what we're looking for is just the approval to go ahead and purchase this, and then it rolls in.
Right. Thanks, Chief. I'm going to let Director Gilman jump in for a moment.
Because I just want to jump in because the dollar amount's actually $230,000 on the order. Because the chief told me he could pay one more year on the lease. So out of his operating because the truck was going to take so long. So
right.
That's why.
Thanks for that. Any more questions on this truck?
This truck is all the factors that we've worked into this. Any time delay on this, it will have significant impacts on the overall cost going forward, as it's already had for the last 3 years, 3 or 4 years that we've been trying to work on this project. The average cost of a fire engine goes up 4% every year. So that's significant. That's significant money. Okay.
Yes.
So the next one is the replacement of engine 5. Now, again, we wanted to be more creative. Instead of buying a typical Class A engine, which again is about $600,000 to replace an identical engine to what we have with our new engine, we looked at what we're short for capabilities within the town, and one of them is we have no with the storms getting as heavy as they had been over the years, especially our winter storms, we really don't have an all-wheel drive available pumper. And so this truck would serve not only a winter response, but will also be our second due engine on a fire, which would carry hose and would be a shorter wheelbase truck that will get us around. And because this truck would be a commercial truck, we're able to knock significant money off of the cost of it. Commercial truck would not do well as a first line engine that we're running all the time. But with this having a specific role within the department, it would enhance our capabilities at the same time being more cost effective. And so engine 5 is I'm asking for $350,000 to replace that truck. When we order 2 trucks together from the same company, we can see, and I don't have the dollar amount, but we can see some cost savings on the overall truck. But we won't know that until we actually sit down and we order it and put it together, spec it out. We have to spec everything from these trucks, all the way from the tires, all the way up to the roof and the light bars and everything that goes on the truck. It's not something you just go to a store and pick. You actually build the truck. So that's where that truck is. And again,
I'm just going to interrupt you briefly, yep, Chief, and let Clerk Scott speak. It looks like maybe we lost Councillor Elmer.
Yeah. Just to acknowledge, Councillor Elmer was having some difficulty. He messaged me, he logged off, and he is going to reconnect, but I wanted to acknowledge that he left the meeting.
Thank you for that. Before we continue, it looks, I got the thumbs up. It looks like we're good to go. All right, I'll let you continue, Chief.
So the last piece of equipment that we're asking for is we have in 1980, I think it's an 85 or an 86 excess military truck for our brush truck. It is not a safe truck for my firefighters. It is very slow. It's got lap belts. Let me rephrase that. It's not the safest truck for our firefighters. It doesn't have the modern safety features like anti-lock brakes, shoulder seat belts, and I really need to get that replaced and taken off the road for the safety of the firefighters. It's a truck that we don't use a lot now because it's so old and because of the condition of the truck. We don't use it, and so we anticipate that we'd use it a lot more with a newer truck. And so what we're asking for, we're not asking for the bigger brush trucks that we have in years past, which could be up to 200,000. I know my predecessors have asked for 150 and then 100,000. What we're really looking for is a cabin chassis with a sturdy body, repurpose some of the equipment that's on our brush truck right now, and really get a truck that is safer for the firefighters to use. And we're requesting $75,000 for that replacement.
Okay. Thanks for the overview. I like how creative.
Yeah, I will mention that, you know, when we have several layers of approval that we have to go through for public safety. One of them is going to our Public Safety Commission, and they are really aware of the financial difficulties within the town. And so they really are impressed on us to do a priority 1, 2, and 3. And what is your priorities? And as I explained to them this year, unfortunately, I'm at the point where I don't have anything on the list but priority ones.
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, I understand that. I do feel like having been on the council for a couple of years, this is a can that's been kicked down the road because, frankly, people didn't know what to do with the large numbers. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that when when there is a need to cut anything, there's sometimes an instinct to go to a department that has a lot of requests before the committee. But I think I'm in agreement with you and the Public Safety Commission that in this case, it makes sense to replace all of these trucks in 1 year. Any questions from counselors about these capital items?
And so then the last one, which is the big one, is the fire station. And there has been a request for $10 million for the design and construction of the first phase of the public safety complex. So I will give you an update on where we are with that. So we're in the process of getting architectural firms to submit proposals that will be reviewed, and hopefully we will figure out an architect going forward, which will answer a lot of questions that everybody in the community has about the fire station. It's really that piece of we have the site picked out, we have contingent plans, we have alternate sites if necessary that we're looking at, but really the architect is really going to pull that together with the project manager. So I'm very excited about that, and that is a project that goes hand in hand with the library. And I know there are time constraints, and we know that we're fast tracking the fire station, but it is it is an important project that goes hand in hand with the revision of the city of Greenfield's infrastructure.
Absolutely. Councillor Forgy, you have a question? Oh, your mic is muted, I believe.
Boy, do I ever. I would actually like to know the $10 million, and this might be, Chief, this might be more with Liz being involved in this as well. What is the funding source for this? Where's it coming from?
It's listed on the order as borrowing.
Okay.
Do you hear me? Oh, okay.
I can't. Can you just explain a little further?
Of borrowing, bonding. So if you look at the, I gotta see what page it's on in the budget book, but there's a stacked debt picture that shows debt coming on and off. And so we have we show bonding every 2 years for just regular capital types of items, and we stay within a predetermined range for those 2 years. Then we also show the big projects on it.
Okay.
To
But this
see
is gonna...
how, excuse me?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So to see how it fits in the debt service line, let's see, 130.
Are you talking about page 139 on the budget book? Is that what you're looking for?
I found another stacked debt one. So it in here. Oh. Well, okay, page 148. It's not as good. I have a better one than this that I can send you. But the point is that we do plan this out. We do manage it. We try to make sure the debt is always within 8 to 10% of the operating budget. And that includes these types of projects, large construction projects. And it includes the capital improvement program, which we bond for kind of routinely every 2 years. So I can tell you that when Roxanne was looking at, Mayor Wiedegardner was looking at what to approve, I said, well, this is how much you can borrow. and so she went through with her red pen and then marked, you know, what was the priorities.
Oh, I think your microphone is muted, Counselor 4G.
Thank
We missed
you.
that.
I think there's a lot of confusion out in the community right now as to where we stand. So I appreciate the chief's remarks on the update as regarding an architect. There's confusion about the site itself. There's confusion about whether or is this authorized or has it been authorized previously as a project, i.e., this is not going out for an override. Is that correct?
Correct.
And is this enough money, this first borrowing, is it enough money to get the project through to completion?
We're hoping so. It's to be determined on what the architects are working on now and the final site.
Mayor Wiedegartner, would you like to add to that?
Well, I'm going to add a couple of things. I will tell you that yesterday was the last day for RFPs for a designer for the fire station, and we had 17 applicants for it. So I feel like this is a project that people out in the community of builders who build fire stations, design and build fire stations, are excited about, even under the situation that we're under. So I was pleased to hear that on the one hand, but I was also thinking about our building committee, who has a subcommittee of the building committee who has to go through those. So that project, part of the process is going forward. And I was on a library building committee meeting this evening, and you know, they're very interested in how it goes forward, and I want you and all of the counselors as well as the community to understand that both building committees and both project managers are working closely to make sure that this works as best it can on the timeline. It's critical for the process to go forward in a reasonable way in which we take full advantage of construction windows and pricing and so forth, that we keep the project on timelines as best we can, on the correct timelines as best we can. So I've asked the Fire Station Building Committee, Public Safety Complex Building Committee to move forward with making sure we get a designer as soon as possible, because part of that person's responsibility is to also help us find the alternative site in the interim. Is $10 million enough? That's what that person will help us determine. So to be very honest with you, we have had people say yes. We can do it within that amount of time. I mean, just out in the building world. But I think when the rubber finally meets the road and we get an architect on, and they'll be able to help us define the cost for it. But $10 million, I feel fairly confident will get you a public safety complex that will accommodate the fire station first, which it needs to, and the police station going forward. But I can't say that with absolute certainty, because two things. We've already been delayed in the fire station, in the library, and that's a costly delay. what we're all trying to avoid are costly delays for both buildings going forward in terms of how fast construction costs can go up. Should COVID-19 really kind of get to a manageable state and we have all of a sudden floodgates open, people wanting to get projects done, this, that, and the other thing, I think there's a reasonable expectation that demand could raise costs going forward. So the sooner we get this both projects where they need to be in their respective building timelines, the sooner we will be able to lock in costs. So that's all I can say. The only thing I wanted to add is that $10 million figure is not something that I put in the budget. That was already there when I got there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so I have a couple questions, and I'm going to call on you both, counselors, in just a moment. But I do think, in light of what the mayor just said, that it makes sense to rewind and just remind new counselors or anyone who's paying attention where we're at, which is that about $500,000 was appropriated by City Council to hire an architect for this project. This project is a fire station. There is as the mayor said, a building committee for a public safety complex. A public safety complex, as far as I'm concerned, is the goal, but nothing with the words public safety complex has been approved by council at this time. So we are moving forward with the understanding that we intend provisionally to build a fire station, and there is at least hope from my end that it will become a public safety complex. I know Councilor Bottomley has a question, but I'm actually going to go back to Councilor 4G just in case you had a follow-up on what the mayor just said.
Yes, thank you, Council Wheeler. I appreciate it. It is a follow-up. Part of the confusion that I'm having, and I think that public is having, is the words public safety complex, which denotes putting all of our emergency management services and together in one place, versus we're building a fire station at this point. So I appreciated your remarks, Councilor Weir. That was very important for me to know. But is there anything else that you or the mayor or the fire chief may be able to add as to how are we going to move from a fire department building to, is it the intention that it all go on the same site? Like across the street from one another or something like that? How are we going to reconcile these two pieces of information and get to the goal?
That's an excellent question, Councilor Forgy. And I'm going to start to answer the question, and as soon as I peter out, which might happen quickly, I'm going to hand it off to someone else. My understanding from having been on council and the capital improvements committee is that we have the appropriation to hire an architect. My hope is that once an architect is hired, that will lead to approval of a site, and at that point that we may be able to identify whether or not a public safety complex is feasible at such a site. And that's my really basic understanding. Mayor, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that you're correct, that your memory and everything is still intact, Otis. And I will add, Chris, that the piece that may be missing here, and I'm going to hand this off to Chief Strahan because he's been in on this from the beginning, if you don't mind, Otis. Just to remind everyone that the demolition of the fire station is on the library budget. So we are not in that $10 million or that $500,000 or whatever, that we are not, that's not part of the budget for the fire station / public safety complex. That's all I wanted to say. And I'm going to hand it off to the chief because he has a better grip on the funding as it was before I came on the scene. Chief Strahan?
We may have actually lost the chief.
No,
I can't tell.
I'm here.
No, you're there. There you are. All right.
So the goal so one thing I think is important for to reiterate to the community that this planning just didn't start because the library was approved and that's when the planning started. The planning for the public safety complex has been 12 or 14 years. We've been having those discussions, and it always has been a public safety complex. That has been the number one goal, is to put us all under one roof. And so the challenge is the financing, right? And so it was determined a few years ago after the Well Street project didn't go through, because remember, a lot of effort went into that project, and for other reasons, everybody has their own reasons of why that didn't happen, but it didn't happen, and so that kind of restarted us at that point. In the meantime, the finances have shifted a little bit, and it really was found that we have to do this in phases, right? We can't just build this big complex in one shot, because the finances of the cities, as you probably hear from multiple people, taxes, that people are concerned with taxes, and start getting to the point where maybe you need an override or a not an override, but what we did for the high school. Thank you. And so it was decided that we would build it in phases. So it is still the goal that when we identify a site and we build a firehouse, we build it in such a way that in the future, whether it's a year from now or 5 years from now or whenever, that you can easily incorporate a police department onto the existing structure of the fire station, and you truly have a public safety complex. But it would be done in phases.
Thank you.
Yes. I would concur with that. That's the way we're approaching it when we speak to the designers going forward.
Great. Thanks for that. Councillor Bottomley, you've been waiting. Do you still have a question?
No, that helped a lot. I just think it's very important because there's been so much confusion around it. I think it's really helpful that at least everyone on the council really has a clear picture. And I know I'm new, so this is all new to me. But I think that's probably one of the things that we get the most questions about. And I'm also wondering if there's some way we can be looped into updates easier, even if they're like just bullet pointed and emailed to the council. Even some of those things that were said about building in stages, I don't know, some of that would be really helpful. I mean, I don't recall seeing anything stated that clearly in the paper about it. I just think for myself, it's very helpful to know what's going on instead of having to necessarily be at every committee meeting and waiting. That was my only comment.
Yeah.
So, Councilor, that's a great comment, and I appreciate the feedback. I will tell you that part of the building committee, we do have a representative from City Council on that committee. Councilor Jarvis is, who I think is on this call, is on the committee. we really need to get the ball rolling with the architect, and then I think the updates will be coming fast and furious.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Thanks. Yeah. I think Councillor Jarvis was here. I don't see him anymore, but I know I've spoken with President Stempel about having him give some updates about the meetings as things move forward. All right. Any more questions on the fire station from councilors? Okay. Or any of the fire capital projects. It's about 10 after 8, and we're going to wrap up, but I don't want to rush us. Councillor DeSorger, you have a question?
Otis, we still have to go over civil defense too.
Thank you. Oh, Councillor DeSorger, your mic is muted.
I've been keeping it muted on purpose. So, do you think that this will be happening in fiscal 2021? Both of these things. I'm hoping they do. Do you
Councillor DeSorger, who would you like your question to be addressed to?
I actually don't know. I just think we're talking about borrowing that money, which I am so hoping that we get this done. But either to the mayor or to, I guess maybe to the mayor, is that reasonable that we are going to be starting both of these things in fiscal 2021?
Well, what I can say to you on the writer side is I don't think that we would have gotten 17 responses to our RFPs if people who are professionals who do this didn't think that this project was a viable project, especially under the circumstances that we're under right now. So that gives me great hope. And we can't really develop as far as the library timeline is concerned, the answer is yes. As far as the fire station timeline, we're only just beginning. I think people have to understand that both projects, the chief referenced a 14-year period for a public safety complex. And I think it's equally that or more that we've been talking about a library, new library as well. So both of these projects have been in the planning stages for a long, long time, and now they're a reality. And what we're dealing with is the reality in a very unreal situation. What I want to say there is it's about the future of Greenfield. And yes, I think there's many phases to these projects. And as the chief, fire chief pointed out, there's many phases to these projects. So it's definitely phase 1 of the fire station and phase 1+2 of the library will happen in not only 2021, but 2020 as well.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to jump on Councillor DeSorger's question and just allow us a chance to talk about this transitional period, which is almost certainly going to exist between the current fire station and the hopefully the new fire station. We have, what am I trying to say here? Well, I guess I'll just ask the chief or you, Mayor, where things are at around identifying a potential temporary fire station. And we don't need to talk details if there are no real details to speak of yet, but have you identified viable candidates for sites?
I'll let the chief start with that, and I'll add if I feel like I need to, but I think he's had a good handle on it.
Sure. So we have, of the working group, we have a sub group that is looking at every other contingency plan for a temporary facility. We have looked at sites. We have looked at different types of buildings. We've looked at rehabbing buildings versus building temporary structures. We're looking at, do you build the fire bays first and then build the living quarters later? We've looked at multiple options, and really where it's going to come down to it is when the project manager sits down with that subgroup with an architect and develop a real concrete based off of what's most cost effective for the community to do this transition. And so we're looking at, I bet you there's a dozen different opportunities and options, and it will get narrowed down to the final solution for it. But there's a lot that goes into it. But there's a lot of work being done to try to identify every contingency or every possibility for a temporary or maybe not a temporary. We feel it's going to be, we're going to have to go into a temporary solution, but you know, you just never know. They may be able to come up with a solution at the existing site for us to operate or partially operate out of. So everything is on the table and everything is being looked at very, very closely.
Thanks, Chief.
I'm sorry, Otis. Did you have a question?
Go ahead,
I was just going to say, the chief is correct in what he's saying. That's the way I understand it. We took a pause, we waited. We decided to wait until we could get a designer on board, and that was at the recommendation of both project managers, I would say, the library and the fire station, to get the OPM on board, to get the designer, which we have, but the OPM said we need the designer because it's part of that. And that person's part of that person's job and what we're going to pay him for or her. Is that they will help us come to that solution. I will say that on the committee, we have some very credible people. We have fire people, we have an architect, and we have who are on the subcommittee, and we have the chair who's been a part of this discussion for probably the better part of those 14 years. So I'm confident and Lord knows Chief Strahan, I've been talking to him about it since about day 3 of my coming on board. So I've put him through his paces. I've sent him out in the community to find every nook and cranny we could put a new a temporary station. So we've eliminated some nooks and some crannies, and we're coming down to, as he said, a half dozen or so options, but we won't know till we get the advice of some more professionals.
I actually think it was hour 12 that you started me on that.
Okay.
All right. Thank you both for that. We know we're going to have more questions on the fire station. This is the big item on the ticket this year, but does anyone else have any for right now? Okay, seeing none. We had one more item to civil defense, and I don't actually have a page number for that.
It would be page 98, I think.
Okay.
104.
Thank you. Great.
That's a,
Right.
oh, there it is. Okay,
Anything
so
you'd like to say?
yeah, just real quick. This is restoring civil defense to where it was a few years ago, with an increase of about $400 or $500 on top of that. I am the emergency management director. which is a challenge in any time, but it is especially a challenge now being the emergency management director and the fire chief. And I have the privilege to serve as both. What we've done with this budget is I put in there a stipend to hire an EOC manager that would report directly to me as the emergency management director that can help maintain not only the EOC, but the plans within the EOC. The remainder of the budget is services that we provide, including the reverse 911 system. But it's basically restoring the budget to what it was 2 or 3 years ago.
Very good. I think it's necessary. Any questions on emergency management from counselors? Yeah, in an emergency, I think we need a fully funded emergency management department, especially when it's under 20,000.
So if I could, if there's no questions with that, I just wanted to end my presentation by really wanting to thank the men and women of all the workers within the city of Greenfield, our DPW, our dispatchers, and especially our emergency responders. I'm awfully proud of the way that those folks have come together. They've stepped up to the challenge that is this COVID emergency. I know for the firefighters, they are dealing with it directly on a daily basis, and that their courage and dedication to the city of Greenfield has my admiration. I couldn't be prouder to be the fire chief in this community.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
We all concur and are deeply grateful to all the work that is being put in right now in this emergency, and we'll get through it together. Okay, so do we have a question from anyone? I think we are ready to finish up. At this point, our next meeting is another FY21 budget meeting a week from tonight, 6 p.m., Thursday, April 23rd. We'll talk about the schools, Greenfield Public Schools, and Franklin Tech. It'll be another long night. If there's nothing else for us, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved by Councillor Forgy. Do I hear a second?
Second by DeSorger.
Second by DeSorger. This meeting is adjourned at 8:22.
Thank you.
And good night, everyone. Thank you, Kathy, for doing this 3 nights in a row.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Everyone.